November 1923, Berlin, Germany. A woman named Frau Eisenmenger leaves her apartment at 7 a.m. to buy groceries. She carries a laundry basket. Not a handbag, not a purse, a laundry basket, because a single handbag cannot hold enough money to buy bread. 6 months earlier, she was a widow with savings, a respectable woman of the German middle class. Her late husband had been a doctor. She had inherited a modest fortune, enough, she believed, to live on for the rest of her life. Today, that fortune is worth less than a single postage stamp, not because she spent it, not because she made bad decisions, but because her government printed money until money stopped meaning anything. This is the story of the Weimar hyperinflation, the most catastrophic monetary collapse in modern history. A collapse that didn't just destroy an economy, it destroyed a class of people. And in doing so, it helped destroy a democracy. Because the story of Weimar hyperinflation doesn't end in 1923, it ends in 1933, with a man named Adolf Hitler standing at a podium in front of a cheering crowd. Understanding how one led to the other, that is what this video is about. But to understand what happened in 1923, we need to start in 1914, because the hyperinflation didn't begin with a collapse, it began with a war. In August 1914, Germany mobilized for what its generals believed would be a short, victorious war. 6 weeks, maybe 8, then home before Christmas. The war lasted 4 years, and it cost more money than anyone had imagined possible. How does a government pay for a war it didn't budget for? There are only 3 ways. You can raise taxes, but taxing citizens to fund a popular war is politically dangerous. It reminds people of the cost. You can borrow money. Germany sold war bonds, IOUs, to its own citizens. Lend us money today, and we'll pay you back with interest when we win. Millions of ordinary Germans invested their savings in war bonds, patriotism and profit combined. Or you can print money. Germany did all 3. But as the war dragged on and victory failed to arrive, borrowing became harder and printing became easier. In 1914, Germany abandoned the gold standard. Before the war, every mark in circulation was backed by a corresponding amount of gold in the Reichsbank's vaults. After 1914, that link was severed. Money was no longer backed by gold. It was backed by the promise of a government at war. And promises, unlike gold, can be made in unlimited quantities. By 1918, Germany had printed so much money that prices had already doubled from pre-war levels. This was not yet hyperinflation. This was just inflation, uncomfortable but manageable. And then Germany lost. The military defeat was devastating enough, but what came next, the peace, was financially catastrophic. June 1919, the Palace of Versailles, outside Paris. The German delegation was presented with the Treaty of Versailles. They were not invited to negotiate, they were invited to sign. The terms were punishing. Germany lost 13% of its territory, including the Rhineland, Upper Silesia, and the Polish corridor. It lost its overseas colonies, it lost its merchant fleet, it lost 10% of its population. And then came the number that would haunt German politics for the next decade: reparations. Germany was required to pay 132 billion gold marks to the Allied powers. At the exchange rate of the time, that was roughly 33 billion US dollars. In today's money, somewhere between 400 billion and 700 billion dollars, depending on how you calculate it. A sum so large that economists at the time, including a young John Maynard Keynes, who resigned from the British delegation in protest, argued it was physically impossible to pay. Keynes wrote a book about it immediately after. He called it The Economic Consequences of the Peace. It was a bestseller. It predicted with remarkable accuracy exactly what was about to happen. Germany had already been printing money to fight the war. Now it had to print even more to meet reparations payments it couldn't afford. The printing presses that had been running hot since 1914, they didn't slow down, they accelerated.
But it wasn't just reparations that pushed Germany over the edge. It was a single event in January 1923 that turned a bad inflation into something the world had never seen before.
By late 1922, Germany had fallen behind on its reparations payments. The German government claimed it simply didn't have the money. The Allied powers, particularly France, were not sympathetic. French Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré made a decision that would accelerate Germany's collapse. On January 11, 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr was the industrial heartland of Germany. Coal mines, steel mills, factories, the economic engine of the entire country. France's logic was simple. If Germany won't pay in money, we will take payment in coal and steel. Germany's response was immediate. The government called for passive resistance. Workers in the Ruhr were ordered to strike, to do nothing, to produce nothing, to hand France an empty factory rather than a working one. And they did. 1 million workers walked off the job. Germany's industrial output collapsed. But those workers still needed to be paid. Their families still needed to eat. So the German government paid them. Not with tax revenue because there wasn't enough. Not with borrowing because no one would lend to Germany anymore. They paid them by printing. Billions, then trillions, then quadrillions of marks. The Reichsbank's printing presses ran day and night. Paper mills struggled to produce enough paper. At the peak of the crisis, the Reichsbank was printing notes so fast that one side of the paper was sometimes left blank. There wasn't time to print both sides. This is when inflation stopped being inflation and became something else entirely, something that economists would study and governments would fear for the next 100 years.
Hyperinflation is not just high prices. It is the complete breakdown of the price system itself. In normal inflation, prices rise slowly. You adjust, you budget differently. It's uncomfortable, but the fundamental logic of money still works. In hyperinflation, prices don't rise slowly. They rise so fast that money loses its function as a store of value, sometimes within hours. Here is what that meant in practice in Germany in 1923. Workers demanded to be paid twice a day, in the morning and at lunch, because wages paid in the morning were worth significantly less by afternoon. Factories organized bucket brigades of workers whose sole job was to carry cash from the accounting office to the canteen, because the price of lunch would change between the time you ordered and the time you paid. Restaurants stopped printing menus. They wrote prices on chalkboards and changed them between courses. People learned to spend money the moment they received it. Holding cash, even for a few hours, meant losing purchasing power. One famous story tells of a woman who left a laundry basket full of cash outside a shop while she went in to buy something. When she came out, the cash was still there, but the basket had been stolen. The basket was worth more than the money. Prices in 1923 were rising at roughly 20 to 25% per day. Let that number settle for a moment. Not per year, not per month, per day. By November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion marks. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. A newspaper that cost 1 mark before the war cost 70 million marks in September 1923. Now here is the question that matters. Who suffered most? Because not everyone suffered equally. And understanding who lost and who gained, that is the key to understanding what hyperinflation does to a society. The Weimar Republic was born in defeat and humiliation. It had been established in November 1918, immediately after Germany's surrender in World War I. From its very first day, it was associated, in many Germans' minds, with the loss of the war, even though it was the Kaiser's government, not the Republic, that had started and lost the conflict. This was the stab-in-the-back myth, the Dolchstoßlegende, the idea that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed from within, by communists, by Jews, by the politicians who signed the armistice. The hyperinflation supercharged this resentment. The German middle class had suffered a catastrophe that felt deeply personal, not an impersonal market force, but a specific betrayal. Their savings had been destroyed, their bonds had been rendered worthless, their life savings had been taken, not by foreign enemies, but by their own government's reckless money printing. And then, having destroyed the middle class with inflation, the government had stabilized the currency, which caused its own crisis, a credit crunch that threw millions out of work. There was no period in the 1920s when ordinary Germans could simply relax and feel that things were stable and fair. Every recovery created a new crisis. The brief golden 20s of 1924 to 1929, a period of genuine recovery, American loans, and cultural flourishing, were built on borrowed money and borrowed time. Then came 1929.
On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the American stock market collapsed. American banks, which had been lending heavily to Germany throughout the 1920s, immediately began calling in their loans. The fragile German recovery, built on American credit, collapsed almost overnight. Unemployment in Germany went from 1.3 million in 1929 to over 6 million by 1932. That was roughly 30% of the entire workforce. For the German middle class, already devastated by the hyperinflation, already deeply mistrustful of the democratic government, this was the final straw. They had been told the Republic would bring stability. Instead, they had experienced defeat, revolution, hyperinflation, a brief recovery, and now depression. A generation of middle-class Germans had tried to do everything right, save money, invest in their country, believe in institutions, and had been destroyed twice in a decade. They were ready to listen to someone who promised a different answer. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, understood the grievances of the German middle class with extraordinary precision. Hitler's speeches in the late 1920s and early 1930s were not primarily targeted at the working class. That was the territory of the communists and social democrats. They were targeted at the Mittelstand. The language was specific and deliberate. The savings that had been stolen, the bonds that had been rendered worthless, the foreign speculators who had picked Germany clean, the Jewish bankers who, in Nazi propaganda, had engineered the inflation for profit. None of this was true. The hyperinflation was caused by war debt and reparations and a catastrophically mismanaged monetary response. It was not a conspiracy. But it was simple. It was visceral, and it landed on an audience that had genuinely been devastated and was looking for someone to blame. In the 1928 elections, the Nazi Party received 2.6% of the vote. In the 1930 elections, the first after the Great Depression began, they received 18.3%. In July 1932, 37.4%. The largest single party in Germany. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The line from the hyperinflation of 1923 to the rise of Hitler in 1933 is not straight. Many things happened in between. The Great Depression was perhaps the more proximate cause. But the hyperinflation had done something that the Depression alone could not have done. It had destroyed the social class, the educated, property-owning, institution-trusting middle class. That is the bedrock of liberal democracy. Without savings, without security, without trust in institutions or money or government, the German middle class became available for a different kind of politics. Now here is the question that makes this history urgent rather than simply interesting. Could it happen again? And what does the Weimar hyperinflation tell us about the financial system we live in today? The Weimar hyperinflation is often treated as a unique historical aberration, something so extreme that it could never be repeated. But hyperinflation is not unique to Germany. It has happened repeatedly and within living memory. Zimbabwe experienced hyperinflation from 2007 to 2009. At its peak, prices were doubling every 24 hours. The government issued a $100 trillion note, a single banknote with 12 zeros, that couldn't buy a bus ticket. Venezuela has experienced hyperinflation since 2016. Millions of people have fled the country. The middle class has been wiped out. Doctors and engineers work as waiters in neighboring countries because the money at home is worthless. Hungary in 1946 experienced the worst hyperinflation ever recorded, worse even than Weimar Germany. Prices doubled every 15 hours. The pattern is always the same: a government under pressure, a printing press, a currency that loses the trust of the people who use it, and a middle class that pays the price. The Weimar hyperinflation is the founding trauma of modern central banking. The Bundesbank, Germany's post-war central bank, was designed specifically to prevent it from ever happening again. Its primary mandate, above all else, was price stability. Not growth, not employment, price stability. When the European Central Bank was established in 1998, it was modeled on the Bundesbank, with price stability enshrined as its primary objective, over the strong lobbying of other European nations who wanted a more flexible mandate. The German insistence on tight monetary policy, low inflation targets, and central bank independence is not irrational conservatism. It is institutional memory, a scar. Germany's deep discomfort with quantitative easing, with the ECB printing money to buy government bonds during the European debt crisis, makes no sense unless you understand 1923. Then it makes complete sense. But the Weimar story also raises questions about our current financial system that are uncomfortable to sit with. Since 2008, central banks in the United States, Europe, Japan, and the UK have created trillions of dollars of new money through quantitative easing. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet went from under $1 trillion before the financial crisis to over $8 trillion by 2022. This is not the same as the Weimar printing press. The mechanisms are different, the safeguards are different, the economic context is different. But the fundamental question, who benefits when money is created and who bears the cost, is the same question the Weimar hyperinflation asks. When central banks create money, asset prices rise, stocks rise, property rises. Those who own assets get richer. Those who hold savings in cash or fixed income accounts, the modern equivalent of the Weimar middle class, see their real returns eroded. The specific mechanism is different. The political consequences have so far been less catastrophic, but the underlying dynamic, monetary policy that benefits asset owners at the expense of savers, is a thread that runs from 1923 Berlin to the present day. The Weimar hyperinflation did not happen because of evil. It happened because of a series of decisions made by governments and central banks under enormous pressure, each one seemingly rational in isolation, that combined to create a catastrophe. That is the most important lesson. Not that it was caused by monsters, but that it was caused by ordinary people making ordinary decisions in extraordinary circumstances and failing to see where those decisions led. In November 1923, Frau Eisenmenger returned home from the market with her laundry basket. She had queued for 3 hours. She had spent enough marks to have retired on 10 years earlier. She bought half a loaf of bread, a small piece of margarine, and a handful of potatoes. Her savings were gone. Her bonds were worthless. Her world, the respectable, educated, comfortable world of the German middle class, had ceased to exist. She was not alone. Millions of Germans had experienced the same destruction. And a decade later, when a man stood up and told them who was responsible and what he would do about it, many of them believed him. The hyperinflation didn't cause the Holocaust, but it created the conditions in which the Holocaust became possible. Money is not neutral. When a government destroys its currency, it doesn't just destroy an economy. It destroys trust. It destroys stability. It destroys the social fabric that makes democracy possible.
And once that fabric is torn, it is very hard to repair. The wheelbarrow is still the most powerful image in the history of inflation, not because of the money in it, but because of what it represents, a civilization carrying the weight of its own collapse. If this changed how you see money, power, and history, subscribe to Imperium Economica, because history doesn't just explain the past, it explains the world you're living in right now.